Have you ever been at I'll start with the negative, the wrong place at the wrong time? Have you ever done that? I mean, just with God's providence, you ended up getting the blunt of it. And I twisted around. Have you ever been at the right place at just the right time? That's amazing. As time goes along and as life is lived before us, there are times in which it is very obvious that we have crossed paths with either our destiny or with definitely God's plan and purpose for the moment. And as I read this passage of Scripture, I couldn't get that thought out of my mind of the fact that things are planned. Nothing happens out of just chance. And the other thought that came to mind was just this very simple thought that as God in the flesh, Jesus acted as God would act. As Jesus lived here on the face of this earth, he was God in the flesh, and before us was God. And as Jesus acted, he acted as God would act. And he gives us that great example throughout. Without question, I hope that it's without question, Jesus is the most well-known person in human history. All of the world's major civilizations know something about our Lord. Only the very most isolated groups and individuals would be unaware of his coming. But then there's a flip side to that. That just as Jesus is the most well-known person in all of human history, he is the least known at the same time. It's amazing how that people know of him, know some things about him, but really have no idea of who he really was. For while the most familiar with his name and some of the facts of his life have lived out before them, certainly his influence is felt and seen throughout history. Opinions concerning Jesus are very diverse. You start asking people, matter of fact, if you do this as an experiment, you'll find it's fascinating to listen to the responses. Not to argue, not to make a point, but just to listen to what people say. If you say, who really was this guy, Jesus? And it's amazing the views about him that will come out. There will be a whole group of people that say, he was a great prophet. Others will say he was the greatest teacher that ever lived the face of the earth. Some people will say, well, he's the guy who died on the cross. Some people, like, for example, the Mormon church, believe that he was a created being and that he's about 2,000 years ahead of us. And in about 2,000 years, we will be as Jesus was then. There's others that say, well, in the spirit, there were two at odds with one another, and Jesus' brother is Satan. I've heard that one. Strange views. The Jehovah's Witnesses believe that he was Michael the Archangel incarnate before man. I remember growing up, there was a song. It was Jesus Christ, Superstar. And we thought of him as this great man who once lived. As you look at the life of Jesus from the Gospel of Luke, there is no question that Luke is attempting to show us that in Jesus' life and in his ministry, in what he said, in the deeds that he did, he was absolutely equal with God himself. Matter of fact, he is God. The passage that we're about to read, Luke chapter number 7, identifies Jesus' deity. And I was thinking, what would a person have to do to prove to you that he was God? Besides the fact of miraculous miracles of healings and abilities. He would have to do something beyond the ability of any human. And the ultimate enemy that we each have is death itself. If he could overcome death, if he could have power over death itself and raise people from the dead, he would prove that he was God. And that's what takes place in this story that we're about to read. Look with me, if you will. Luke chapter number 7. Let's start in verse number 11. It says, soon afterwards, well, he just left the Capernaum and he had just been there with the centurion. You remember he said, the centurion says, I'm not worthy for you to come into my house. Just say the word and my servant will be healed. And he did that. So soon afterwards, I'd say a day or so afterwards, Jesus went to a town that you've never heard of before. It's called Nain. And his disciples and a large crowd went along with him. Everywhere it seemed that he went, they followed him. And as he approached the town gate, a dead person was being carried out. It was a funeral. The only son of his mother, and she was a widow. Information that is interesting that somehow they knew. And a large crowd from that town was with her. And when the Lord saw her, look at what it says. His heart went out to her. He had what's called compassion upon her. And look at what he says. He says, don't cry. Don't cry. And then he went up and he touched the coffin. And those carrying it stood still. And he said, young man, I say to you, get up. And the dead man sat up and began to talk. And Jesus gave him back to his mother. They were all filled with, and look at that little word, I circled that in my Bible, awe. And they praise God. And look at what they say. A great prophet has appeared amongst us. God has come to help his people. What an interesting story. As the news about this one called Jesus spreads throughout now the whole countryside. It says all of Judea and all the surrounding country, they heard about this one called Jesus. As God in the flesh, Jesus acted as God would act. I thought about that. He acted as God would act. He acted as God would act. Could he act any other way? After all, he was God. He is God. He couldn't act any other way. I mean, I've tried to act different than the way I am. I've worked real hard at acting different. All of a sudden I become a hypocrite because I'm acting different than I really am. And I finally give up and just say, look, I am who I am. And as Popeye would say, I can be no more. And what you see is what you get. And I'm sorry about that. And that's about as far as I go. But Jesus acted as God would act. And here we see him acting with a purpose. So many times I don't have a purpose. People think they have a purpose, but I really don't have any purpose at all. You know, I'm just floating around, just doing as I feel like I want to do, when I want to do it, how I want to do it. But here we see Jesus acting as God would act, and he does so with a purpose. With a purpose. The little phrase here soon afterwards points back to that healing of the centurion's servant. It again proved that Jesus was something more than just a mortal man. He had the ability to heal people, and they were seeing this over and over again. And Luke is attempting to present Jesus to each of us as something more than just a man who walks the face of the earth. It is an indefinite time designation here. Soon afterwards, I said, well, a day or so, in a little town called Nain. You won't hear much about that city. Matter of fact, it's very difficult to even find where it was on the map. They said it was about 6 miles northeast of Nazareth. And if you have a good map, maybe you could find Nazareth sometime. But anyway, on the other side of the hill there was this little city called Nain. And there was in this city a young boy, and it was a Shunammite boy. And there was a great prophet who lived in Israel. His name was Elisha. And guess what he did in this little city called Nain? That's right. It was there that Elisha called out to God. And God raised the Shunammite mother's son and allowed him to come back. About 3 miles away was a village called Endor. That's where Saul visited the medium to seek after what he should do. And when God wouldn't respond to him in the timing that he thought he should, you remember the story of Saul. And Jesus, along with his disciples, leave Capernaum, and they go to this very small, nondescript town. You know, God always acts with a purpose. And I sit there and I thought about that. I said, well, why in the world would Jesus leave Capernaum, which was a pretty good-sized town? And things are going good there, by the way. I mean, his fame is running all over the countryside. People are coming from as far away as Jerusalem and all throughout Judea, and the coastal cities of Tyre and Sidon are coming down just to hear him speak, and things are going good. Why would you leave? But he did, because God had a plan, a purpose. There are people that have a real hard time with this idea. I've never really wrestled with this thought, but maybe you're one of those people that you have a hard time with the fact that God has things planned out. Anyone that's watched any of the Back to the Futures realize that we have this idea that we're in control of our destiny. That we want to think that we're the captain of our soul, and that whatever we do creates some kind of futuristic plan for us, and now that we're the ones in charge. Never had a problem with the fact that God is in control. They use a big word called sovereignty when you think about God being in control. Settled, unchanging, unfathomable. Kind of the ideas here of sovereign. Listen to the greatest, what I think of as the greatest preacher of all times next to Jesus. Isaiah chapter 46, 2 verses says, God declared, I am God and there is no other. I am God and there is no one like me, declaring the end from the beginning. And from ancient times, things which have not been done, saying, my purpose will be established, and I will establish all my good pleasure. God is God, who can and do anything that he so desires. No rules. He made them. He created them. Isaiah goes on in verse number 11 of chapter number 55. He says, my word, God speaking, which goes forth from my mouth, will not return to me empty, without accomplishing what I desire, and without succeeding in the matters for which I sent it. Anyone here that's raised teenagers realizes that they do not have that accomplished in their life. You say, go and do this, and you might get it done. I want you to clean your room, and you say it with such emphatic authority. And of course, those people who don't have teenagers, they say, now when I have kids. And we just kind of smile and go on. But when God says, this is the way it's going to be, that's it. It's done. There is no room for error. Now think about this. Jesus is God. God in the flesh. And as God in the flesh, Jesus acts with resolve to accomplish his divine purposes. On the way from Judea to Galilee, Jesus says, I want to go through Samaria. They all says, we're not going through Samaria. Jesus says, I have to go through Samaria. And they say, we don't want to go through because of those sickening, half-breed, underclass people that are around there. Sort of like going through the worst part of town, if you can avoid it. You remember he had a divine destiny with a particular woman who was going to meet him there in Samaria. She didn't know it, but he knew it. And said, I have an appointment with this person, I didn't give all the details, in Samaria, at this particular point in time, just when she is going to come out to draw water from a well. He knew the timetable of his own death. He knew when his hour was going to be fulfilled. Matter of fact, he says, it's not time yet. And he slips through the crowd, seemingly disappears amongst them. Whether it was supernatural or not, was able to just maneuver through the crowd that wanted to throw him off the cliff. Remember the moment. One of the blasphemous ideas espoused by some is this idea that there is a unwritten destiny for men. That is so untrue. It is damning. Each of us have a destiny. We will find ourselves either eternally with God or eternally separated from God. And there's no middle ground. And here, Jesus in the flesh knows all the details of when to get to this little city at a particular time. Notice, it's kind of amazing here, that Luke reveals that no one in Jesus' party would have known the facts that Luke writes down. This was an only son that had died. This was a widow woman who had lost her only son. In Psalm 139, it reveals that God knows every single detail about us. Matter of fact, I encourage you to write down that passage that I just referenced, Psalm 139. In verse number 1 of that psalm, it's going to say, God knows everything there is to know about me. In verse number 2, it's going to say that God knows every one of my thoughts. In verse number 3, he knows every single one of my deeds, my actions. In verse number 5, it's going to say that he goes in front of me and he follows behind me. In verse number 8, it's going to say he goes with me even to the grave. And in verse number 16, it says he knew me even before I was born. Figure that one out. If your mind doesn't go tilt, 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 referring back to the day when there was mechanical pinball machines that if you tried to cheat, it would mess up and go, it would flash tilt. Everybody in the place knew that you cheated. Now, if you have the ability to think this one through, God knew you before you were even born. Every day of my life is recorded, it says, in your book. Every moment was laid out before a single day had passed. God is in charge. And the faster and the sooner that we accept that, the easier and better it's going to be for each of us. God is in charge. Meditate on this for just a moment. I mean, this is bigger than I can think. Before my parents or my grandparents' conception, God knew when and where I was going to be born. I was born in Mount Clemens, Michigan. None of you have ever heard of that before. Mount Clemens General Hospital, it's called. The only reason I know that is that occasionally you have to write it down on things. I mean, my parents were basically vagabonds that went from place to place to place to place and never lived anywhere for any length of time. And I tease and say that they were chasing them. But anyway, I happened to be born in that. Why were you born where you were? And God knew that. He knew the exact moment of when I was going to be born. My individual DNA and my fingerprints are recorded by God. Before they even knew anything about fingerprints, God miraculously made it so that each one of us are made special in His sight. Matter of fact, it says that the exact date of my death, God already knows. That's why if we're a mature believer, we don't worry over God's protection in our lives. Or even our children's lives, because we know that God knows. And God's in charge. Now, I think we pray and we ask God to protect them and we worry about them, and that's all true and good, but God is sovereign. Did you hear what I said? God is sovereign. If it's His timing, it's going to take place. There's very few places, a few in Scripture that records that God extended someone's days. It's a rare case. And I think God even knew that He was going to extend His days before He extended those days. God in the flesh, in Jesus' life, knew the exact moment that it would take for Him to leave Capernaum and walk with these disciples some 25 miles, if my recordings are correct, to this little city called Nain, so that He would get there at the exact moment that the funeral procession was going to be leaving the city gate. And He knew exactly who was going to die and when they were going to die, so that they had the funeral at the exact same time, and that it was planned. God acts with divine providence. Now that's another one of them words. Providence. I guess what I'm saying is that God has control over all human actions, choices, events, and even determines them. We like to have it in our mind that we're in charge. We want to think that we're the ones that are determining these things. I serve a bigger God than that. Hugely bigger God than that. I think given the staggering complexities involved in coordinating free will with God's plan is somewhat beyond my ability to understand. So therefore, I conclude I'm not going to understand it, and I'm not going to be concerned about it then. I'm just going to put my hands in His hands, and I'm going to follow Him. Nain wasn't big enough to have a wall around it. It had a main street. It had what was called a city gate, which would be sort of like the center of activity. It was a place where people gathered together to do all business, all the transactions, all the socializing. It's where the elders met to determine cases. And in God's providential timing, Jesus and His entourage approached the city gate after their journey from Capernaum just exactly at the same time that this dead man is being carried out. I've been to a lot of funerals. Hundreds and hundreds of funerals. I remember having to stop and wait for funerals to go by while I was in funeral processions. I mean, what do you do when two funeral processions come together? Who yields to the other, you know? And I can remember stupid things like that. In God's providential timing, Jesus comes in just exactly at this time. And the funeral's over, and the people are removing the corpse onto the bear or the stretcher, and they're going outside to the town, to the cemetery. And it's what I call the very hardest part of the entire event. And Luke tells us that making that tragic loss here is even worse for this particular woman, for she's a widow and this is her only boy. This means she is now on her own. All means of support has now been totally removed, and she is now totally dependent upon the welfare system of the temple to survive. It also marks the end of her family line. We sit here and we think about it. Every time in the Old Testament there's any talk about death, it symbolizes the end, the finale. This woman and her son's casket bearers were headed out with this sizable crowd of people from that city that made up the procession. And when they get to the city gate, Jesus and his entourage now meets them. Who yields to who? Who stops? You know, I put a little note down, and it might be silly to some people, but it's pretty profound in my little brain. Jesus didn't need an alarm clock. He didn't need a day timer. He didn't have to have that thing that I carry around with me that hour by hour, minute by minute will program out exactly what I'm supposed to be doing when I'm supposed to be doing it. You got it? He's in charge. He was never late. He was never early. He was always on time. Is there something that you could grab from that? In the midst of the struggle, in the midst of the problem, in the midst of the storm, we're convinced that God's late. God's never late. Always, always, always on time. Who not only knew the storm, but planned the storm. To the detail. There was a time, Stephen lives in Austin. Phil and Dixie, they go down to Austin. Now, they don't know, I don't think Stephen, maybe you knew Stephen was in Austin, I don't know. But he definitely didn't know you were in Austin. And you're traveling through the mall, decide you're having fun. And who do you run into? But Stephen. I mean, eyes get big, right? I mean, of all the people, the thousands of people that are around this place, how in the world could I ever run into anyone that I know? It's wild how those things happen, isn't it? Planning. The age-old question becomes, and if you haven't run this one in your mind yet, I might as well just bring it up. If God is in control, why do bad things happen? Some people may think because God is in control of all things that he wouldn't allow anything bad to happen to those who follow him. They come up with some idea that anything that bad happens must obviously mean that I walked outside of the will of God somehow. I'll give you a little hint. It's a long, laborious story, but read the book of Job to find the answer. They falsely assume that personal tragedies are either sin or somehow a lack of God's compassion. Some people become doubtful. Other people become bitter. There are even those who reject God altogether because maybe something bad or something they think bad happens to them. I've discovered this one thing. I am the most in tune with God when things aren't going good. You'd think it would be the opposite of that, wouldn't you? I mean, when things are going good and I'm walking arm in arm and God's whistling in my ear, that, boy, we'd be right. I found just the opposite is true. That I'm the most vulnerable when I'm grieving or lonely. And I think sometimes people mistake pain for an absence of God, when in reality, that is when God is at his very closest. Read the illustration of the footprints in the sand and you'll understand my analogy. It's a horrible tragedy in life when something bad happens, in our mind, bad. I remember I wasn't too long of being here in Enid, and I got a call from a family that had lost the baby. Sudden SIDS, it's called. Infant death. It's a sad moment. And you know what the number one question always is? And you know what you have to do? Trust. It's easy for me to stand here when everything's going good and no one's standing at the door that's going to arrest us or pull us into jail or burn the place down or us in it, to talk about God in control. It's another thing to be talking about God in control when it's not looking like He is very much in control. That's the reason why I have to talk to you right now while I got your attention here. Okay, look, things are not always going to be good. Somewhere along the way, somebody taught somebody that when you accept the Lord, after that, you wake up in the morning and angels sing to you. You know, that when you get out of bed, that they throw rose petals at your feet as you walk in for your morning coffee. And of course, the coffee pot's there and it's working and the coffee's ready and it smells so wonderful and great and the day flows as if God is walking there with you. And if you trust in the Lord with all your heart, that's the way it's going to be. And I don't know why they told that lie. But you know what happened? Somebody taught that, and then they told somebody else, and told somebody else, till pretty soon people started believing it. And then when things didn't happen that way, we said, uh-oh, we must have done something wrong. When things go bad, as they will, the first thought is God's in control. God hadn't lost control, God is in control. And number two, He knew this was going to take place before it took place. This might be a surprise to me, but it's not to Him. You follow this? All in this little story of Jesus showing up at a certain time in a certain place to do a certain thing for a certain person that we never heard of before and will never hear of again. Have you ever had two passing like this? And here it is right here in front of you. God had a purpose for showing up that day. It says that when He saw her, He had compassion upon her. I thought when God acted, He acted in compassion. Give you 100 cases in the Old Testament where most people think God is revengeful and God is angry and God's mad and God's doing all these wicked things. 100 examples in the Old Testament where God is compassionate. And here, walking upon this scene, it's tragic, yes. It's chaotic, yes. The heart of the Lord went out to this woman and He felt compassion for her. He didn't just politely stand aside in respect, put His hand over His heart, drop His head, watch the casket go by. He interrupted the procession. And He acted. He acted at that moment. And in as you see this compassion, that's the word I want you to get a hold of. It's the same kind of verb as love. It has to have action behind it. Without the action behind the word, it is a false feeling. It is a sense of wrong. But in this case, you see the action, don't you? Because not only does He have compassion, the compassion is followed up with action. And that's where, again, God is revealed. God is not on the sideline watching it take place. God is actively involved in our lives. He's not a grandfather rocking in the rocking chair, sitting there nodding as things happen. And here, Jesus acted as God would act by divine power. Verse number 14 and 15. Jesus acted here with purpose. God's providentially arranged the events of this day to take place just as they would take place, and He had a plan. All of the contingency plans of the universe was put on hold for just a moment as God worked out His self right before our very eyes. His compassion for those who were suffering led to the conclusion here that I can't sit by, I have to act. And God acted. He exercised His divine power and overcame the events of this particular day. I think He stunned the crowd, including the disciples. His power directly demonstrated that He is God. He goes up and He touches the coffin. To the Jews, that made Him ceremonially unclean. But here God, who is in perfect universe, this perfect person, at the perfect moment, does not become unclean, but rather takes that which is unclean and makes it clean. At this particular moment, Jesus reveals his power over people. Normally, attempting to halt a funeral procession and touching the corpse or touching the coffin would have produced outrage. But you don't see that here at all. There was and I don't have time to get into this, but there are countless times, and I thought of the one, Balaam's donkey, that was in tune with God and responded to God and did that which is godly, even though the prophet didn't want to. But here, the Lord commanded, authorized his presence, and the bearers all come to a halt. And he demonstrates his power over death itself. This person had died most likely within the last 24 hours because there was some kind of law that you had to bury him before sundown. Things happen quickly. And the creator of the universe, the one that spoken word called this universe into existence, merely says, young man, I say to you, arise. And at Jesus' command, the dead man sits up and begins to speak. I said I've been at hundreds of funerals. I guarantee you I've never seen a corpse set up. Oh, I've heard all kinds of weird stories. Have you heard those stories? Ain't happening. That's proper English, by the way. Ain't happening. Not only did he set up, but immediately he began to speak. Now, for those of you who have read all these books about people who've died and come back, I want to say, what did he talk about? It's interesting, he doesn't say anything that he said, does it? I don't think it was significant what he said, but I thought it was interesting that he didn't say, I saw a great light, and I saw God, and I saw the devil, or I saw where. He didn't say nothing. He begins to talk. I think he says to his mom, hey, Mom, what's happening? What are you doing this for? What's going on? I'm a little hungry. What's for supper? I want you to also notice that no one had to have faith. You see that? There's no faith exercised in this story anywhere. No one has to walk up and say, I'm going to say 50,000 Hail Marys. No one does that. No one sits here and says, if I give all of my deeds from now on to good causes, or I give 50 million, billion, trillion to whatever. No one exercises faith at all. No one even prays. No one even asks. Did you see that? Faith is not a prerequisite for God's power to operate. God is sovereign in his activities, his power in accordance with his own will. It was God's will at this moment. And faith wasn't present at all. Okay, I got to wrap this up. Somebody said, oh man. What's the response? I mean, speechless. What do you say? I mean, raising the dead brought an abrupt, unexpected, shocking end to a funeral. The NIV says that they were at, remember I told you to circle that little word, awe? The New Living Translation, along with the old King James, uses a different word besides awe. A-W-E. You know what it says? Some of you have maybe already looked, saw it. Fear. Fear. Matter of fact, it's this particular Greek word that we get our word called phobia. Phobia. Talking from experience here, if I were at a funeral and some guy came up alongside and tried to raise the guy from the dead, I'd be traumatized. I'd be overwhelmed. I'd be angry. I'd be filled with terror if he was successful. And in response to this, they were filled with fear. And secondly, they began glorifying God because they got the point. Nobody raises the dead except God. 400 years had gone by since anything miraculous had ever happened in Israel. I don't think we get that point. I mean, it had been 400 years since they had a prophet. Nothing ever happened. And now miracle after miracle after miracle are taking place to the point that the broken-hearted woman here is comforted. And the people that God visited here went out and told this story, and wouldn't you? Everywhere they went, to the point that it went all over Israel. But here's the sad part. They missed the point that God was actually present in the person of Jesus. And they declared him to be did you see it? A prophet. They put him at equals with Elijah and Elisha. They both raised people from the dead, matter of fact, in that same particular area. The resurrections came there because of the power of God, not because of the person, but the power of God. But here, the very power of God is demonstrated before our very eyes. And they witnessed it. And they go, wow, a great prophet is amongst us today. And to be quite honest with you, it sort of made me take a step back and shake my head. What do you have to do? What do you have to do to show it, to prove it, to reveal it to some people? Can I give you a contrast? One of Jesus' friends dies. He waits to make sure he's real dead. Really dead. I mean dead. 3 days later, he's in the tomb. It's sealed up. He shows up. He talks to the sisters. They're upset. They say, if you'd have been here, this wouldn't have happened. We're kind of mad at you. You weren't here. You could have been here. You chose not to be here. And I don't like it a whole lot that you weren't here. That's what they really said. They cleaned it all up for us, right? And then they came to the point where they agreed with the Lord, after they got done venting, which is not bad to vent sometimes, right? But then to come to this point, Jesus, I realize you're the resurrection and life. He that believes in you, though he were dead, yet shall he live. And we sung a little song, yet shall he live, yet shall he live. And Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. And they realize they're in the presence of God himself. I've already repeated the fact that this young man who died, no real reason why he died, doesn't tell me why or anything about it. Might have been an accident. Could have been a long illness. I don't really know. It doesn't say. Was completely surprised that he was being raised from the dead. Everybody else was at awe. They were surprised at death. It took them off guard. I think it's interesting that every one of us have a destiny with this thing called death. And we shouldn't be surprised at all. Sometimes God makes us a little uncomfortable so that he can actually talk to us. We need to realize that this life is not permanent. We're here for a moment. What's the Bible say? We're here for a moment, and then what happens? Gone. Like a vapor. My life passes as swiftly as the evening shadow. Seems like when the sun goes down, when it starts to go down, and then bam, it's gone. And I think that if there was an ultimate enemy that each one of us would face, it would be this idea of death. It's the sting of death as a result of sin. Jesus says, I'm the resurrection and the life. He that believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. I thought for a moment, God let this guy die. I mean, come on, God. You got another plan? Got another way to do this? I mean, I don't want to die. Dying is the pits. You ever watch someone die? I mean, it is not pretty at all. God allowed this guy to die. He allowed this mom to grieve. I mean, he allowed all of these neighbors to have to go through this funeral. I mean, everybody loves funerals, right? Why? Why? One word answer. Glory. God received glory. And that's the way he chose for us to live. That he might receive glory of whether I live or whether I die, he is to receive glory. There's one thing I wanted you to get away from here with. I hope that you got it by now. Jesus is God. He is God. He raised the dead to prove that he's God. And he's going to raise the dead. And he does all of this to show us that he is in control. Our response, Father, here am I. Do with me as you see fit. Father, I'm yours, you're mine. I surrender. And with that, God receives glory.